Hey everybody, John Wagnon here with DevCentral, and today we're going to talk about a vulnerability that was recently released that deals with the traffic management user interface on Big IP. This vulnerability has a CVE number. It's CVE number 2020-5902, and like I said, it deals with the traffic management user interface. I'll just put TMUI up here, and just to give you kind of an idea of what's going on, you've got, in a deployment, you have a big IP, right? And then you've got users out here, attempting to or connecting to a web application. So let's just say you have a web app over here, and you've got all your different servers configured. And in order to get to the web application, obviously users come through the big IP, and then the big IP does all kinds of good stuff to allow access back to your web application. So that's awesome and good for the users attempting to or accessing the web application, but there's also the administrative function. So I'll put like an admin right here that is going to need to access the big IP. And when an administrator accesses the big IP to do things like set up a virtual server or configure an SSL profile or any number of things, right? They're going to enter the big IP through what we call the configuration utility or the traffic management user interface. And you can do that via graphical user interface, the GUI, like on a web page, or you can do it via command line. But nonetheless, we're talking about the administrative access into the big IP here. And just to give you an idea of the severity of this vulnerability, it was given a CVSS, or the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, ranking of a 10, which is like the worst. This is a remote code execution capability for this vulnerability. So basically this means that someone could gain full system access to your big IP, remotely, execute code on the big IP, and that's not a good thing, obviously. And so rather than kind of, not talk about it, we would rather get it out there and talk about this vulnerability and how you can mitigate that. So there are a couple of key things that I want to talk about today. The first and foremost thing that I'll talk about is a security advisory has been published by F5 and has been updated a couple of times and will potentially continue to be updated as more information comes in or as needed. And so we'll link to that security advisory. So I would encourage everyone to go there, read that, get all the information you can from that. It's going to have all the details of everything that you need to know. But just to give you an overview of how to mitigate this, there's a couple of things that I'm going to mention. The first is the management port. So management port, you need to not expose the management port to the open internet. All right. In order to access the big IP from an administrative perspective through the management port of the big IP, that needs to be done from a secure network. That needs to be locked down to IP addresses that you trust, and certainly does not need to be available to the open internet. There's a tool called Shodan out there that you can use to do searches on different services and ports and all that are open to the internet. And a recent Shodan search showed that about 8,000 big IPs are deployed out there around the world that have their management port exposed to the open internet, which means if you have the IP address to get into that, you can just sit down, type it in, and you're at the login page for a big IP. So that's not a good thing. You don't want to expose it to the open internet. So do not expose your management port to the open internet. That is going to that's just good business practice to begin with, but that's certainly going to help in the case of this vulnerability. And then the next thing I'll mention is a self IP. So self IPs. Self IPs, if you have those opened up ports that you can allow access into self IPs that are tied to the configuration utility, you need to block access to that. So block access to the configuration utility by locking down the ports of your self IPs. And there's a couple of different ways to do that. You get into the self IP itself, the configuration part of the self IP, when you're in your big IP, and you can select a setting that says allow none. So I'll put that on there, so allow none. And then there's also a setting that says allow custom. So I'll put allow custom. And ideally you say allow none, and then that just locks down any kind of port for the self IP. But if you must have a port open for self-IP access, then you can say allow custom, and then you can select, what ports would you have open for the self-IP. If you allow custom, then we would say the port that is accessed or that is used by the configuration utility, you need to not allow that as one of the ports that's allowed in the self-IP custom list if you go that route. And on that note, the configuration utility uses TCP port 443 for most versions, most applications for the Big IP deployment. There are some cases, some VE deployments in later versions of Big IP that use TCP port 8443, and so you can check your version, your deployment to see which port is used for the configuration utility. So again, that's if you allow custom, if you need to allow some ports for self-IP, just make sure you do not allow the ports that are used by the configuration utility. So those couple of things are going to be very critical as you mitigate this. But the ultimate thing is to upgrade your version. So upgrade your software to a known fixed version. That security advisory that I talked about, there's a table in that security advisory right there, kind of at the top, that shows you the versions that are vulnerable and then the known fixed versions as well. So we highly recommend that you upgrade to the known fixed version that you possibly can. So if for some reason you cannot upgrade to that known fixed version, these are a couple of things that you could do in the meantime to help mitigate this vulnerability. The last thing that I would mention is if you want to look for evidence of an attacker trying to exploit this vulnerability, depending on the version that you're running, you can look at different log files. So you have like var log, I'll just put var log / and then you can do like LTM or audit. But then also you can look at the journal. I'm going to put journal CTL. So you can examine the output of varlog or journal CTL depending on the version that you're running. You can look at that in the security advisory as well to check to see what version is going to tell you where to look for evidence. And there's some pretty good instructions on there on exactly what command to type in, the syntax to use, and then what to look for in these places to see if someone has tried to exploit this vulnerability on your Big IP. So anyway, so this is a vulnerability that was just released. It's a level 10 on the CVSS scale, which is not good. But we want to get it out there. We want to tell you about it. We want you to know how to mitigate this, and we want you to be safe out there. So thanks for hanging in there, watching this Lightboard lesson video with us today. Hey, you can click up here on our DevCentral logo and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll see you guys out there in the community.